What does it mean to be a Christian? The term Christian was not the original term for followers of Christ. Actually, the term Christian was first used in the city of Antioch in Syria, probably as a nickname for those who were Jesus' followers. Christians were initially called the Way. We're not told why this was so, but it might have been because Jesus said to his disciples on the night he was betrayed that he was the way, the truth, and the life. Eugene Peterson, the author of the message, insightfully declared, "The Jesus way, wedded to the Jesus truth, brings about the Jesus life. The Jesus way, wedded to the Jesus truth, brings about the Jesus life." He continues, "We can't proclaim the Jesus truth but then do it in any old way we like. Nor can we follow the Jesus way without speaking the Jesus truth." Now, I found his words profound and wise and practical. I've been a follower of Jesus for 45 years, and on occasions I have witnessed some Christians attempt to do what Eugene Peterson says we shouldn't do, which is to proclaim the Jesus truth, but to do it in a way that has been argumentative or disagreeable or judgmental or at odds with our message, or where it has been more about winning an argument over some theological position, for instance. We can't proclaim the Jesus truth but then do it in any old way we like. John describes Jesus as the Word who became flesh and made his dwelling among us. He says, "We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." Hear that? Jesus, full of grace and truth. The Jesus way is always the way of grace and truth. It's never an either or. It is a both and. Grace, yes. Truth, yes. Well, in the world of fake news, we need the truth. And in a world of ungrace, we need grace. Yes, there is such a word, ungrace. I admit that I was quite surprised to discover that the word ungrace has found its way into the Merriam-Webster dictionary. Not surprisingly, ungrace means lack of grace, or the opposite of grace even. It's a good word to describe the values and ways of the world, which are so often in contrast to grace. Our world is a dog-eat-dog. It's a survival of the fittest. Look out for number one. Get to the top. Never mind who you stand on to get there. Every person for themselves. From nursery school onwards, we are taught how to succeed in this world of ungrace. We are taught the early bird gets the worm. No pain, no gain. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Demand your rights. Grace is the very opposite of these values. Grace offers an altogether different message, refreshingly at odds with the value of our world. Grace tells us we get what we don't deserve. We deserve punishment, and we got forgiveness. We deserve wrath. We got mercy. We deserve to be called enemies, but we are welcomed as sons and daughters. Now that's grace. And grace and generosity is the language of the kingdom of God. The world says, push your way to the top, for you ascend into greatness, but the kingdom of God says the way to greatness is down, not up. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The world says, fight your corner, stand up for your rights. The kingdom of heaven says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. The world says, revenge is sweet, get your own back, don't let anyone get one over on you. Whilst the kingdom says, blessed are the merciful, and blessed are the pure in heart. Listen to the words of Jesus recorded in Matthew chapter 5. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbour and hate your enemy. Now that's what the world says. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. And that's the message of Jesus. That's the message of grace. That's the Jesus way. The Jesus way is the way of grace. Grace is both our message and the manner in which we share that message with the world. We can't proclaim the Jesus truth and then do it in any old way we like. Essentially, we can't declare the message of grace in an ungracious way or in a way which is unchristlike. Over the years, I've told and retold a story that Philip Yancey tells in two of his books, the Jesus I Never Knew and What's So Amazing About Grace. It's a true story that haunted him and continues to haunt me as well. And if you've been around for a while in Tamworth Elim Church, you most definitely would have heard this story before. It's the story of a prostitute who came to a friend of his who was working in downtown Chicago. And this prostitute was homeless, sick, and unable to buy food for a 2-year-old daughter. Her story was really heartbreaking. Yancey's friend then asked her if she had ever thought of going to church for help. She responded with a look of pure, naive shock. "Church!" she cried. "Why should I ever go there? I was already feeling terrible about myself. They just make me feel worse." Well, I first read that story over 20 years ago, but it's a story that still affects me. The one place that lady could have received grace, she felt unable to access. I've often asked myself, why was that so? I wonder if she'd had a bad experience of church at some point. Maybe some holier-than-thou types had looked down their noses at her in a condemning manner. Maybe she was on the receiving end of unkind or harsh words. Or maybe she had just bought into a certain stereotype. After all, the world's media loves to typecast religious people as bigots and hypocrites and fanatics. And maybe that was the reason. And if that was her reason, then it just shows us the magnitude of the job that is before us to change the mindset of how communities and towns around us view the church. Personally, from experience, most of the Christians I know are quite wonderful, self-giving, generous and gracious people. But sadly, there are enough examples of ungrace to get all Christians tarred with the same brush. It was author Mark Twain who once referred to some people as being good in the worst sense of the word. And that was certainly a good description of the religious leaders of Jesus' day. Many of them were good in the sense that they lived high moral standards and scrupulously kept their own laws and regulations. But at the same time, they were hard and unmerciful to anyone who didn't conform to their ways. They were very quick to point the finger to those they regarded as sinners. One little girl must have picked up this Pharisaic behaviour in some church people when she prayed, "Dear Lord, make the bad people good and make the good people nice." The Chicago prostitute felt the church had nothing for her. How different it was with Jesus. Those who were classed as the dregs of society fled to him, not away from him. The worse a person felt about himself, herself, the more likely that he or she found Jesus as a refuge. The gospel is full of such stories. For example, John tells us the story of the woman who was caught in an act of adultery, caught red-handed and no doubt red-faced by the religious leaders, and was brought to Jesus. And they asked the question, "Moses commands us to stone such women. What do you say?" It was a catch-22 situation. They didn't care about the woman. She was just a pawn in their cruel game, collateral damage if you like. This was not about her, but it was a ploy meant to trap Jesus. If he'd answered, "Stone her," it would have contradicted his message of grace and forgiveness. If he answered, "Free her," he would have been accused as an enemy of Moses. But let me ask another question. When this poor, frightened, embarrassed woman was brought before Jesus, what did Jesus see in her? Did he he a sinner that deserved to be punished? Or someone who needed to be judged? Maybe a hopeless case of immorality? No, I don't believe he did. He saw a woman who needed his forgiveness. Someone who needed a new start and a clean slate. Someone who needed another chance. And Jesus turned to the religious leaders and said to them, "He that is without sin, cast the first stone." It was a perfect answer. They set out to trap him, but Jesus, as ever, got the upper hand. Well, very aware of their own sinfulness, they left one at a time, tells John. The older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman. That's an interesting phrase, isn't it? The older ones first. I wonder why John gives us that little detail. Maybe you can chew on that one. Discuss it in your life groups this week. He then said, "Where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, Lord," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you. Live your life of sin." Jesus didn't pretend her life was acceptable to God, because it wasn't. She needed to make some changes. However, unlike the religious leaders who treated her with contempt, Jesus treated her as a person, as a child of God, loved by him. They often say, don't they, that a picture paints 1,000 words. And in this portrait of Jesus, we're shown that the Jesus way, wedded to the Jesus truth, brings about the Jesus life. And then in John chapter 4, there's another story, this time of a Samaritan woman that Jesus met at the well. The woman had had 5 different husbands. In those days, it was the husband who initiated divorce. It was a patriarchal society where women simply didn't have any rights. And Jesus could have begun the conversation by pointing out that this woman had made a right mess of her life. But as you read the story, there was no wagging fingers, there were no stern looks. Jesus didn't say, "Young woman, do you not realize the immoral thing that you are doing in living with this man who is not your husband?" He could have said, "Shame on you." But in effect, what he said was, "I sense you are thirsty." And then Jesus went on to tell her of the water that she was drinking from the well would never satisfy. But he had living water that would quench her thirst forever. Living water. What a wonderful metaphor that is for the abundant life that Jesus was offering her. Jesus, full of grace and truth. The Jesus way, wedded to the Jesus truth, brings about the Jesus life. The Pharisees of Jesus' day had a great problem in believing that God loves all people, and were agitated when they saw Jesus socialize with the tax collectors and the half-breed Samaritans and the foreigners and women of ill repute. How can this man be from God if he associates with such people as this? In Luke chapter 19, we read the story of Jesus entering Jericho. He looked up into a sycamore tree where he spotted Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was a tax collector for the Romans. He was a man who was hated by his own people, someone who was regarded as a traitor, a thief. Tax collectors often dishonestly lined their own pockets with the tax they collected. But instead of taking the opportunity that afternoon to preach to the crowd, Jesus singled out this rogue and said that he was going to stay at his house that day. And as you can imagine, that must have so infuriated the crowds. In fact, Luke tells us that all the people began to see this and began to mutter, "He has gone to the house of a sinner." Jesus, what are you playing at? Don't you know who this guy is? He's an enemy, not a friend. He's a traitor. He's a thief. Well, Jesus focused all of his energy and time on one small, lonely, self-centered man. Jesus generously gave his time to someone that no one else bothered with. Now, don't get me wrong here. Zacchaeus was not a nice man. But by his own admission, he cheated and defrauded his own people. He lived a selfish life, living on the profits of crime. Yet this encounter with Jesus caused him to change. Listen to how Luke tells the story. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." Then Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now, I give half my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Do you know what? Generosity begets generosity. Jesus' encounter with this sad little man changed his life forever. Jesus treated him as a human being. He was a lost soul, a man despised by society, but loved by God. I'm so privileged to be a part of a church family that reaches out in a range of practical ways to the lost, the least, and the lonely of our community and our town. Jesus gave Zacchaeus the precious gift of his time. The result was a changed man. Zacchaeus promised to give half of his possessions to the poor and to pay back anyone who he had cheated 4 times, indicating that the grace of God was working in his life. In Luke chapter 6, Jesus helped us understand a bit more clearly what the Jesus way looks like. This is what he writes. "Do not judge and you will not be judged. Do not condemn and you will not be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven. Give and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." Well, that is the Jesus way of life. The Message translation of Jesus' words is even more poignant. Don't pick on people, jump on their failures, criticize their faults, unless, of course, you want the same treatment. Don't condemn those who are down. That hardness can boomerang. Be easy on people. You'll find life a lot easier. Give away your life. You'll find life given back. But not merely given back with bonus and blessing. Giving, not getting, is the way. Generosity begets generosity. Well, the Jesus way is the way of grace and generosity of spirit. Do not judge, and you will not be judged, said Jesus. Have you ever judged people by the way that they look? There's an old wise saying, not found in the Bible actually, but you might have used this before. And the saying is, do not judge a book by its cover. Very wise indeed. The religious people of Jesus' day were full of judgment, but Jesus, in contrast, was full of grace. They wrote people off. Jesus accepted them as they were. People fled away from the religious leaders, but they fled to Jesus. And sadly, down through the ages, religious people have often been accused of not reflecting the generosity of Jesus. In the mid-19th century, William and Catherine Booth brought into the church in East London many ragged people with shabby clothes and untidy appearances. The more well-to-do folk of their church, who regarded themselves as a bit too good for the likes of those who were Booth's friends, distanced themselves and complained about such people coming to their church. Well, William and Catherine Booth left the church with all of their ragged friends, and they set up the Salvation Army. It was William Berkeley, a Scottish professor of divinity, who once wrote, "More people have been brought into the church by the kindness of real Christian love than by all the theological arguments in the world. And more people have been driven from the church by the hardness and ugliness of so-called Christianity than by all the doubts in the world." Basically, the Jesus way needs to be wedded to the Jesus truth to bring about the Jesus life. Do not condemn and you will not be condemned, said Jesus. And Jesus could have condemned the woman caught in adultery, but he replied to her, "Neither do I condemn you. Live your life of sin." He might have condemned the Samaritan woman for her immorality, but rather, in so many words, he says, I see that you're thirsty. He then went on to offer her living water that would quench her thirst forever. He might have condemned Zacchaeus for his fraudulent schemes of getting rich on the backs of poor people, but he reached out with generosity and grace. The Jesus way is also our way. Well, let me just come into land here. In Steve Chalk's book, Intelligent Church, he tells the story of a man called Agostino de Antonio, a sculptor from Florence in Italy, who worked diligently and unsuccessfully on a large piece of marble for many months. Eventually he gave it up and he simply couldn't go on and do anything with the stone. Other sculptors worked with the same piece of marble, but ultimately none could really craft it into anything of beauty. The stone was discarded. It lay on a rubbish heap for 40 years. That seemingly worthless piece of rock was to become one of the world's most famous pieces of Renaissance art, Michelangelo's wonderful statue, David. After its completion, Michelangelo was often told how beautiful his work was. His standard reply was both simple and humble. All he had done, he said, was to reveal the beauty that was already hidden deep inside the marble. And our calling is to not only proclaim the Jesus truth to our communities and towns, but to do so in the Jesus way, with generosity and with grace. To have a generous attitude towards people who might not appear to be very beautiful on either the outside or the inside. People who might have messed up and those who have been judged and criticized all their lives. It is so important to remind ourselves that those which society disregards as sinners are loved unconditionally by God. Our love for one another and for others is the key factor and the crucial mark of the Christian church in the eyes of the world. The man in the street couldn't care less about our doctrinal differences, our religious squabbles, or our churchy debates. The Jesus way, wedded to the Jesus truth, brings about the Jesus life. God bless you. Have a great week.